I cannot fix on the hour or the spot or the look or the words which laid the foundation. It is too long ago. I was in the middle before I knew that I had begun. Welcome to AMI Audiobook Review, the weekly podcast where we chat all things audiobooks. I'm your host, Ramya Amuthan. The quote from this week's episode is from Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. And yes, if you heard last week's episode, I was mildly inspired by Amir Khan's investment into the book. I am not going to confirm or deny whether he finished reading the book. We can find out directly from him at the end of the month. But honestly, I thought regardless of whether or not you enjoyed Pride and Prejudice or enjoyed Jane Austen's writing, it is an absolute cultural phenomenon, this book. And so many books from that point onwards that were inspired by her writing, and she is an absolute writer of lines. So bring it on for the quote of the week. Let's find out what's on the CELA homepage. If you go to celalibrary.ca, there you can find the catalog of audiobooks, ebooks, and Daisy accessible books via the Center for Equitable Library Access. And the three main titles, the featured titles on the homepage are Vera Wong's Unsolicited Advice for Murderers by Jesse Q. Santanto. And this is a mystery and crime stories. Number 2, The Climate Book by Greta Thunberg. This is for the environment. And the final one up there is The White Lady by Jacqueline Winspire. And this is a historical fiction if you feel to read any of that. We are going to be checking in with Karen McKay from the Center for Equitable Library Access, talking about Pride Month. We want to celebrate. We want to recognize. We do that all through literature, and we are absolutely privileged to have the books we have, the stories we have, and the kinds of conversations that we're able to get deep into because of the things that we read, that we expose ourselves to. And honestly, this doesn't even have to be books. It can be social media, right? There are just tons of content and absolute ways for us to understand and explore a little further. So we continue that recognition and celebration with Karen McKay. She'll be back to join us this month. This is AMI Audiobook Review, the weekly podcast where we chat all things audiobooks. I'm your host, Ramya Amuthan, and because it is the first Saturday of the month when we release this podcast, we check in with our friends from the Center for Equitable Library Access. Usually friends are a duo of Karen and Teresa, but today just Karen joining us. Well, I already missed Teresa. Karen McKay is the communications manager at CELA, and she's here to talk a little bit about Pride. We're continuing the conversation around Pride Month and the kinds of books that we can read, engulf ourselves in to try and celebrate and recognize and learn. So Karen, welcome back.
Thanks so much. It's nice to be chatting with you.
You too. So where do you want to start? Because we have kind of a book list that we want to go through and then discuss around that. What's the best place?
Well, so one of the books I thought I'd start with is called The Civil War of Amos Abernathy, and it's by Michael Leali, published in 2022. And it's a kid's book, but as I was sort of researching books to profile for Pride for CELA, this one kind of caught my eye. So Amos is a history buff, and he's also got a crush on a male friend. So he's wondering if there's anybody else out there like him in history, because he doesn't remember hearing any stories. And so because he's this history buff, he kind of digs in and sees what he can find. And he discovers that there's a person named Albert D.J. Cashier, who was a Civil War soldier who came from the area where he lived. And he might have been identified as a trans man if he lived today. And so Amos, he wants to share this story, Albert's story, with folks. But he lives in a very divided 21st century town, which I think is, not uncommon for small town kids, particularly in the U.S. maybe, but small town kids. And so he takes this on. He wants people to know that there have been people throughout history whose stories have not been fully told. And so I thought that was a really interesting thing. So I'm a cis white woman. I have not had the experience of not being able to find representation of my own experiences. And I just thought this was a beautiful way to start to talk about those kinds of conversations about what stories we hear, what stories we don't hear, what stories history has tried to erase or suppress, and starting it at a level where kids can understand. Like, that's where the cultural shift, I think, starts to happen, right? Like, our kids are the ones, I can speak from experience, our kids are the ones that move us into new ways of thinking around some of these social constructs, because they're growing up in a different kind of environment than the ones we grew up in. So I thought this is a really interesting place to start, just the importance of representation in literature, not only for adults, for authors, for communities, but I think really importantly for kids too. So so that was one I thought was really interesting place to start.
It is the question that we ponder over in our own experiences. If you feel like, as I felt, growing up marginalized or not necessarily represented in the context of who do I look up to, like who's trailblazed for me. And so when you take that question and say, let's write around that and have people explore that question at all, who before me gave me the opportunity to say, I know what that feels like. Oh, this person knows what I feel like, is quite interesting, actually.
It is. Just start and there. So sort of coming out of that, I was also thinking about a lot of the books that I was looking at, and we have lots of new ones in the collection. A lot of them are writing more now from different dimensions of diversity. Like, there's a lot more of intersectionality happening around sort of LGBTQ2 plus characters, but also talking about sort of their whole selves, their broader experiences in the world, right? Because I would imagine, I don't know, but I would imagine that being a gay white woman is very different than being a queer Muslim girl, for example, right? The social constructs around those things are very different. And so what I'm seeing a lot of in these books that are coming out, there's a lot based around sort of struggling with religion and sexuality and gender identity and those components, and also race, like the way those things are all intersecting. And so there's a few books that are really sort of interesting. One of them is called The Queer Evangelist, and the subtitle is A Socialist Clergy's Radically Honest Tale, and it's by Sherry DeNovo. So this is a memoir. Sherry DeNovo is Canadian, and she is a United Church of Canada minister in Toronto, and she is like an on the streets minister. Like, the goal for the congregation that she leads is really to serve and serve all communities and be a really opening and welcome and inclusive place. So you might look at her and go, oh, she's gay, she's a minister, she has very left leanings, very social justice orientations in her work. She also believes in the literal understanding of the Bible in some of the key stories. So, a lot of leftist ministers will say, oh, it's sort of an allegory, or it's an illustrative tale. I was talking to a colleague about this today. Any box you want to put her in, she doesn't fit. And so I think those stories are really important because they show the richness of life. It moves us out of our tendencies to stereotype people or to think about a single story about somebody, and into a fuller understanding of what it means to be your whole self with all of these different dimensions of diversity, all these different impacts on you and the way that you impact society. So I think she's a dynamo. Like, I think the book is really interesting, but I think part of what's so interesting is just we're starting to get more of these owned stories that are not sort of single concepts. They represent more authenticity, I think, is maybe the way to say it. Yeah,
and individualism. And really, you talked about the differences of intersectionalities and experiences that way. And I think of my own culture in this kind of everybody fits into this. This is how we do things when you're from this place, when you are this person. And so when you don't fit into that box, as you mentioned earlier, you start to think like, what is wrong with me? Or why can't I? And does everybody else fit in a box except me? And these kind of spiraling questions. And the opposite of that is to be curious, right? Like, is to say, everybody wants to feel like their story is their own and that they can tell it loudly, proudly, appreciatively, respectfully, and just own it that way. So that's the kind of thing I think we're moving towards, where we're not necessarily interested in everybody squeezing themselves into this social contract, this concept, this culture, the norm, and say instead, what's your story?
Yeah. It's interesting. So part of what I was thinking about when we were talking about this is, are LGBTQ2+ stories, are they mainstream now? Are we still sort of thinking about them collectively? I mean, as a niche story? Do they cross over into, are white cis women reading these books in their book clubs? Are you talking about this around the water cooler at the office? Are kids in grade 12 picking these books as part of their independent novel studies? Or are we still sort of seeing them as a niche category? And so, working with the library, I kind of fall back on, we have a library category, but we're trying to push all of these books into these categories, and this is dictated by something much bigger than CELA in terms of how this works. But there's I have a whole list here. There's LGBTQ kind of rom-com books, like light beach reads. We've got lesbian characters, we've got gay characters, we've got trans characters, we've got bi characters. Like, we have all of these different sort of characters in these books, and yet we're trying to push them into this small kind of box. But we've got rom-coms, we've got kids books, we've got parenting books about what to, if you're a member of this community as a parent, or if you've got a child that's a member of this community, how do you parent them? Well, that should be in parenting, not LGBTQ. We need to sort of, I think, and that comes back to what we're talking about, recognize that there are so many dimensions of diversity, and this is one of them. It's informative. It's important when we talk about it. It's important when we read about it. But I think that we need to see them in fuller characters, right? That have lots of other things going on in their lives, which, some of the books that are coming out, I really, really love that's kind of the way that they're heading.
Yeah, and not to mention that if people are going through realizations, changes, acceptance at different stages of their own lives, right? So it's important that we cover all of that with all the mediums that you pointed out, because I'm at this stage, if I were to discover something about myself that I want to explore, I'm not going to pick up a kid's book, right? And that's the same thing for TV and audio and everything else, because who knows who is going to get to that piece, that conversation, that talk, and when.
Yeah, exactly. And so we need to have lots of different books for lots of different people. And I think this is fair to say. I think we're still at the stage as well where we need to have books for people who are just beginning their acceptance journey of course, these other communities. So there's a really beautiful book that just came out. It's written by Catherine Hernandez. It's called The Story of Us. And it's this really beautiful story about it's told from the perspective of an infant who has not yet been, or a fetus not yet been born, and so sort of has this all-knowing and all-understanding vantage point. But the main character is Mary Grace, and she is a Filipino worker, and she's left her husband to become a caregiver in Hong Kong, and then she comes to Canada, and she works in schools and she works in different environments, and she's really feeling like she's not found her place. And so she becomes a caregiver to like a PSW, a personal support worker, to an elderly patient who's suffering from the beginnings of Alzheimer's disease. She's a very fragile health situation. And Mary Grace's time with this person that she's giving care to really challenges her conservative beliefs. Liz is a trans woman, and so that's not something that's sort of been in Mary Grace's experience. It doesn't fit into her religious and conservative views, but you get to see this beautiful friendship start to develop between these two characters, between Mary Grace and Liz. The friendship really grows. Mary Grace steps up to really be more than just a caregiver, like to be an advocate and to understand. And so both women's worlds are being rocked by different things. And Mary Grace's baby, who she's pregnant with, we get to see that growth. And so it's a really neat parallel, like the growth of an infant, the growth of a person in a new situation, and the growth of changing beliefs and stuff. It's a beautiful story. Like, highly recommend if people want to pick this book up. But I love that it starts from a place of respect, not only for Liz, who's the trans character, but also for the woman who's trying to figure out how to reconcile, beliefs that maybe are not as accepting as they could be with a person that she's really growing to care for. And I think that that's really an important piece as well, because, like you've probably been watching the news, right? There's lots of pushback on Pride Month, especially in schools. Mm-hmm. People just need a place to start to really, I think, understand the humanity. And books are a fantastic place for that.
Oh, of course they are. Of course, because we don't even necessarily need to feel like we're in it. We're just kind of taking in a story or two and being able to understand where these characters, these people are coming from, and potentially relate on some levels. But really, as you said, respect first and love first. What do you enjoy about reading a book like this, Karen? I'm curious because, as you mentioned, you were self-identified as a cis
white woman,
gendered white woman, yes. So what brings you to the places that are important when you read things like this?
So that's a really excellent question. So certainly I get a different perspective. I mean, that's kind of an obvious statement. But what I love are books like We've Always Been Here by Samra Habib, which was a 2020 Canada Reads book. And I think it was maybe one of the first kind of books with buzz that came out that explored different dimensions of diversity. So it's a memoir, and Samra's a Muslim minority immigrant, and she's facing persecution around sort of all different dimensions of her identity, right? Like that she's Black, that she's Muslim, that she's queer. Like I found that perspective fascinating and very obviously different from my own experiences. And so, I mean, the storytelling is important. I don't want to be kind of talked down to, which is kind of why I like memoirs in this situation a lot. I want to be challenged in terms of, stretching my mind to encompass new ideas. And I want to be challenged in terms of my own internal biases and that sort of thing. But in the end, I really want to fall in love with a character. Like, I want to be cheering for them, or I want to be, like in all the books that I read, right? I want to be captivated and, cheering for a character. So, I mean, I'll admit that some of the books that I've read, or portions that I've read, I'm like, it's kind of like a diversity, equity, and inclusion playbook in fiction form. And that's not really what I want. Like, we want, I think, rich characters that we connect with, because then that helps us understand their story or stories that might be similar to them in our communities in a way that comes with the respect and the love that you talked about before.
Yeah. I feel really energized hearing that, especially because you're not coming from a place where you're like, I'm good. It's more like, I know that I have these internal biases. I know that this is not necessarily going to be easy to stretch my mind and understand, but still, nonetheless, you're like, but this book or this character might make it worth it for me. What other books do we want to highlight?
So there's another one called Hajib Butch Blues, and it's written under a pseudonym, which, I mean, it kind of speaks to this challenges still in writing and talking about these. So the pseudonym is Lamia, and she's a queer Muslim. She was born in South Asia, but she moved to the Middle East as a young girl. And she's always sort of felt the easiest way through life is just to be hiding. She doesn't want to sort of go out there, but she starts to explore the stories in the Quran, which is the Muslim holy book. And she starts to see the characters in these stories, the people in these stories, as maybe being more like her than she thought. So, there's a story about Miriam who was, she became pregnant, but she said, I've never been touched by a man. And so, the Lamia wonders, well, maybe she's more like me than not. Or maybe because Allah does not have male or female characteristics rather, could he be binary or she be binary or it be, so she, as a young person, I think she's about 14 when this memoir is sort of taking place. She's trying to find her place in the world. She's trying to find people, characters, stories that she can relate to. And I think it's beautiful that she turns to a book that's been giving her comfort in other ways, and finds her place in there. So, I think that's a really interesting one. The Story of Us, I would definitely recommend if you have a young person, the Civil War of Amos Abernathy again, and then Making Love with the Land by Joshua Whitehood. It's nominated for the Indigenous Voices Awards, which will be announced later on the 21st of June. And it's a nonfiction book. Everybody loved Johnny Appleseed, which was his first sort of book. This one's nonfiction, and so he uses lots and lots of different techniques to explore things about body and language and love of the land. It's quite heart-wrenching in places about what it means to live as a queer Indigenous person. And the term that he uses is in the rupture between identities. And so I think that's a really profound way to look at that. So highly recommend that one as well.
Oh gosh, I just love the depth of the language being used to describe different, I don't know, question marks, I guess. And it's so fabulous, but also obviously so difficult to express these things out to the world and have people buy in, and not necessarily even buy in, but just to say, yeah, okay, let me listen to what you have to say.
To engage.
Yeah.
Which is why I think, going back to what we talked about earlier, kids' books, really important, especially for families, but, just beautiful stories that sort of open your mind like you might have been as a child, being open to more things, are important. The fun, rom-com, light reads, also an excellent way to just kind of slip into some of these ideas. And then the more serious memoirs and literature, I think really, as you say, the language and the storytelling and the nuances and the depth of some of the themes that are being explored, I think really help us open our hearts and minds, because we can connect with the character.
It's poetic, right? Like there's sometimes when I have no clue exactly what this person is going through, and maybe they don't either, right, depending on what it is that they're trying to express, but there's some poetry in being in that confusion, in that lostness of your life, your identity, your intersectionality, your representation, your expression in the world, like who you are, who people think you are. And there's so much depth in that. And I really admire that people can, put that stuff out there. And I really appreciate, what you said about kids' books, but also who we were as kids or at different phases in our lives where we were more open to and are more willing to explore that and engage with people. Because not all the time are we in stages where we can take things in, take people in.
Exactly. I think it depends, as you say, on where sort of we are in our life. But if we're feeling lost and we can read a story about a young queer Muslim girl feeling lost or feeling unseen, you have an opportunity to connect at a human level, not necessarily at a descriptive level in terms of your identities, but what we want is empathy for one another, right? She feels lost, I feel lost, or she's struggling with being her true self. I mean, that's a struggle that I think many of us go through. So those abilities to connect with themes that aren't necessarily specific to an LGBTQ situation, but are just a human situation. And that's what we need to recognize in one another.
Yeah, absolutely. Karen, this has been such a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for bringing this to us for Pride Month.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for talking with me.
Okay, we'll chat with you next month. Karen McKay, and usually Teresa Power as well, joining us from the Center for Equitable Library Access to kick off the month here on AMI Audiobook Review. Following that episode, we have Know Your Narrator with Sarah Hillis, so check that out next week. I'm your host, Ramia Amuddin, with Nasreen Abdelmajid, our technical producer. And until next time, happy audiobook listening.